A flight attendant publicly humiliates a black boy and tears up his ticket without even asking who he is. But she didn't know who his father was. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what city you're from. The morning sunlight spilled through the thin curtains of the small bedroom, casting soft, diagonal lines across the wooden floorboards. Outside, the world was already stirring. Faint sounds of traffic, the rustling of leaves, and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog punctuated the calm. But inside, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of how important this day was. 12-year-old Jaden Devereaux sat at the edge of his neatly made bed, staring at the packed backpack resting against his leg. The backpack wasn't particularly large, but inside it carried everything he needed. A carefully folded letter from his mother, a sketchbook with worn edges, a bag of trail mix she had packed the night before, a pair of noise-canceling headphones, and, tucked safely into the front pocket, his boarding pass printed in crisp black ink. On the strap dangled a bright orange tag marked "Unaccompanied Minor" in large, clear letters. That small tag was both a privilege and a burden. Jaden's eyes kept drifting toward the letter. He hadn't opened it yet, though he had watched his mother fold it carefully, slipping it between the pages of his sketchbook before zipping the pocket shut. He knew it was full of the kind of words she always saved for moments like this, when he was about to step into something new, something terrifying and exhilarating at once. In the hallway, he could hear her moving quietly in the kitchen, the soft clatter of mugs, the faint hum of a radio playing something old and comforting. She always hummed along when she thought no one was listening. Across the house, his father's deeper, more purposeful voice filtered through the air, measured and low, as he spoke into his phone, already working, already immersed in the machinery of the world he had built. Jaden let out a breath and glanced at the digital clock on his nightstand. 6:12 a.m. Too early for most, but today the day began early for all of them. The flight wasn't until 9, but his father had insisted they arrive at the airport 2 hours in advance, just to ensure there were no complications. Jaden understood that wasn't only about logistics. His father always planned for the things that others didn't see coming. When the call of his name floated down the hall, Jaden swung his backpack onto his shoulders and stood. The weight settled evenly across his back. He had rehearsed this day in his head for weeks, counted down the days until he would finally step onto a plane by himself, cross the country to Seattle for the robotics camp his father had quietly but purposefully arranged for him. It wasn't just any camp. It was one of the best. A place where older, smarter kids competed, built, created, and he would be the only one from his middle school attending. He padded into the kitchen, where the smell of buttered toast and freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air. His mother stood at the counter, fussing over a small paper bag of snacks, her brow knit in that worried expression she always wore when he was about to leave her sight. "You have everything?" she asked without looking up, her hands moving swiftly, sealing the bag and setting it next to his backpack. He nodded. "Yeah." His father entered a moment later, tall, composed, dressed in a simple gray jacket over a crisp white shirt. There was nothing ostentatious about Marcus Devereaux, not unless you knew who he was, not unless you had walked through an airport terminal and seen his name on the side of a building, printed in black letters on glossy corporate plaques. "You ready?" his father asked, meeting his eyes. Jaden hesitated before nodding again. He was ready, or at least he wanted to be. The drive to the airport was quiet. The city stretched and yawned around them, the early light softening the sharp edges of buildings and turning the streets to silver. His mother sat in the front passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at him through the rearview mirror. His father kept one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting against his leg, tapping a steady rhythm against the fabric of his pants. They passed familiar neighborhoods, parks, the corner store where Jaden bought snacks after school, the library where he spent quiet afternoons sketching robots and machines that would never exist outside the pages of his notebook. All of it seemed distant this morning, like it belonged to someone else's life. At the airport, they moved through security smoothly. His father knew every shortcut, every efficient way to maneuver the crowd. They stopped at a small coffee stand near the terminal, where Jaden's mother hugged him tightly, pressing her face into his shoulder as if to memorize the shape of him. "Don't forget to look out the window," she whispered. "You'll see the mountains if the sky's clear. It'll look like you're flying over a painting." He nodded, swallowing around the lump in his throat. His father's embrace was briefer but firm, a hand on his shoulder, a nod. "You know the rules," Marcus said. "You'll be fine." Jaden watched them walk away, his mother glancing back once before they disappeared into the crowd. He turned toward the gate, the printed boarding pass crinkling slightly in his pocket, the orange tag on his backpack swaying with each step. The terminal was alive with the usual chaos, announcements echoing over the speakers, rolling suitcases rattling across the tile, travelers in various stages of exhaustion and impatience. Jaden made his way to Gate 17, weaving through the crowd with a practiced ease. When he arrived, the waiting area was half full. A family clustered near the windows, a group of business travelers typing furiously on laptops, an elderly couple flipping through magazines. The gate agent stood behind the counter, scanning tickets with mechanical efficiency. Jaden approached the line slowly, waiting until it thinned. His heart thudded in his chest, not from fear, but from the weight of everything riding on this moment. He kept thinking about the mountains, about the letter in his sketchbook, about how proud his mother had looked that morning. When it was his turn, he stepped forward, handing the agent his boarding pass. She glanced at the orange tag, nodded once, and scanned the ticket without incident. "Wait over there," she said, pointing to a row of chairs near the window. "Someone will escort you onto the plane." Jaden nodded and moved to the designated area, sitting quietly, his backpack hugged against his chest. Outside the window, the tarmac stretched out toward the horizon, planes taxiing, service vehicles zipping back and forth. The sky was pale blue, cloudless. He pulled out his sketchbook, flipping to the page where his mother's letter rested. Unfolding it carefully, he read her words again, the ones that stayed with him. "Sit by the window. Look at the mountains. Remember, you belong in the sky as much as anyone." He folded the letter and slipped it back between the pages, letting his fingers rest on the cover of the sketchbook. For the first time since waking up, he allowed himself to smile. Everything was going according to plan. But outside the glass, beyond the hum of engines and rolling suitcases, something was already shifting, an invisible thread pulling tight, unnoticed by anyone in the terminal, least of all by Jaden himself. What he did not know, what he could not yet imagine, was that within the next hour, the weight of this day would change. That his ticket, his name, his right to move freely through the world would be questioned, torn apart in front of strangers. That the very people tasked with ensuring safe passage would become the ones who blocked his way. For now, though, Jaden sat still, eyes fixed on the runway, unaware that the flight he had dreamed of was about to become something else entirely. Jaden had never been good at waiting, not because he lacked patience, but because when he sat still for too long, his mind filled the quiet spaces with possibilities. Some good, others shadowed with uncertainty. As he sat by the window at Gate 17, the terminal around him buzzing with travelers coming and going, he kept glancing at the boarding door, the open corridor that would soon lead to the plane. He imagined the feel of the cool metal armrest beneath his hand, the gentle roar of the engines building as the aircraft prepared to leave the ground. He imagined the view his mother had promised, the mountains stretching like brushstrokes across the horizon. Time crawled forward, the minutes punctuated by overhead announcements and the occasional thud of luggage wheels over uneven tiles. Jaden glanced around, scanning the faces of the other passengers. Most were too absorbed in their own worlds to notice him. A child sitting quietly, hands folded over his backpack, waiting to be told it was his turn. And then the shift happened, so small at first that he barely noticed. A new attendant approached the gate counter. She moved briskly, her navy blazer perfectly pressed, a flash of red lipstick too sharp for her complexion. Her name badge caught the light as she passed. Meredith Caldwell. She carried herself with the air of someone who had long ago decided she was the most competent person in the room, and she wore that certainty like armor. Jaden watched her absently as she took her place behind the counter, exchanging a few words with the agent who had scanned his ticket earlier. The handoff was swift, mechanical. The other agent nodded and walked away, leaving Meredith in charge of the boarding process. The overhead speaker chimed, announcing the final boarding call for a different flight at another gate. Meredith barely glanced up. She tapped at her keyboard, adjusted the sleeves of her jacket, and surveyed the waiting area with a quick, calculating glance. Jaden's stomach fluttered as she stepped away from the counter and approached the row of chairs where he sat. He straightened instinctively, sliding his backpack strap higher on his shoulder. This was the moment, he thought. The part where they would escort him down the jetway, like the other unaccompanied minors he'd seen on past trips. But the look on Meredith's face was not one of routine professionalism. It was sharp, almost suspicious. "You," she said, stopping in front of him. "Are you waiting for Flight 262 to Seattle?" Jaden nodded quickly, reaching for the printed boarding pass in his pocket. "Yes, ma'am. I'm an unaccompanied minor." She didn't look at the pass. Instead, her eyes swept over him. His brown skin, his dark curls, the orange tag on his backpack, as if assembling a puzzle she didn't like the shape of. "Where are your parents?" she asked, her tone clipped. Jaden cleared his throat, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm flying alone. My dad already boarded." Meredith's lips pressed into a thin line. She extended her hand without looking down. "Let me see your boarding pass." He handed it over obediently, along with the confirmation form from check-in, the page clearly marked with his name, his father's, and all the details required by the airline's policy for minors traveling alone. She glanced at the paper, but only for a heartbeat, then folded it between two fingers as if it might stain her skin. "Young man," she said, voice lowering slightly, "this doesn't look right." Jaden blinked, confused. "It's my ticket. I checked in already." Meredith let out a long, theatrical sigh, the kind adults used when they had already made up their mind and were just waiting for everyone else to catch up. "We don't allow children to roam around the terminal without supervision," she announced, not just to him, but to everyone within earshot. Jaden felt heat rise in his face. "I'm not roaming," he replied, his voice small but clear. "I'm sitting where they told me to wait." Without another word, Meredith lifted the boarding pass between her fingers and, in one smooth motion, tore it in half. The sound of the paper ripping was quiet but devastating, like fabric tearing under strain. Jaden stared at the two pieces in her hand, his breath catching in his throat. "There," she said, as if she'd solved a particularly irritating problem. "Now you can wait right here until we figure out who you really are." The terminal seemed to tilt beneath him, the edges of the world slipping out of focus. He looked around, hoping someone, anyone, would step in, would say something. A few passengers glanced in their direction, curiosity flickering across their faces, but no one moved. No one spoke. Jaden swallowed, the lump in his throat growing heavier by the second. "I didn't do anything," he said quietly. "You're creating a disturbance," Meredith replied sharply, folding her arms. "Let's not make this worse." The words landed like stones in his chest. He wanted to protest, to explain, to shout that this wasn't fair, but the weight of the moment pinned him in place. He could feel the eyes of strangers on him, their discomfort, their unwillingness to interfere. Meredith turned to a young attendant wearing a headset, a lanky man with a boyish face who looked barely older than Jaden himself. "Call security," she instructed coolly. "We may have a situation." The attendant hesitated, his eyes flicking toward Jaden, uncertainty flashing across his face. Then, without a word, he tapped his headset and stepped away. Jaden's heart pounded in his ears. He felt small, smaller than he had ever felt, the ground shifting beneath him not because of any airplane but because of something heavier, something uglier. He thought about the letter in his backpack, the one that told him he belonged in the sky. And for the first time that morning, he wasn't sure if that was true. Jaden sat motionless, his backpack pressed tightly against his chest, as though the fabric and straps might somehow shield him from the weight of the glances now resting on him. His torn boarding pass remained in Meredith's hand, crumpled and discarded, as if it had never meant anything at all. Around him, the terminal had not stopped moving. The announcement board still flickered. The muffled voice over the intercom still called passengers to gates. The coffee stand continued serving cups to sleepy travelers. But for Jaden, everything had stopped. He could still hear her voice, sharp and final, telling him to stay put, telling him he was a disturbance, as if he had done something wrong, as if merely existing in that space had made him a problem. The young attendant with the headset, the one Meredith had ordered to call security, stood a few feet away, fidgeting with the wire running from his earpiece. His name tag read Alex. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, glancing toward Jaden and then away again, his expression tight and conflicted. Jaden tried to meet his eyes once, hoping for something, an apology, maybe, or even just a flicker of acknowledgement. But Alex looked away quickly, pretending to study the monitor at the gate desk. The minutes stretched, and Jaden's muscles ached from the effort of staying still. He kept waiting for someone, anyone, to come over, to say that there had been a mistake, to tell him he could still board. But the air around him felt heavy and unmoving, like glass sealed over something fragile. Passengers walked by, slowing when they noticed the small, dark-skinned boy sitting alone under the sharp gaze of the uniformed woman behind the counter. Some looked curious. Others barely glanced his way before continuing toward their own gates. A few whispered, the edges of their words slipping past Jaden's ears without clarity, but none of them stopped. None of them asked if he was all right. A family with young children settled into seats across from him. The parents exchanged a look when they noticed the way Meredith stood with her arms crossed, her posture rigid with authority. The father leaned over to the mother and muttered something under his breath. She shook her head and pulled her children closer. Jaden's fingers curled tightly around the strap of his backpack. His mouth felt dry, his throat aching with the effort not to cry. He thought about the way his mother had hugged him that morning, how she had whispered to look out the window at the mountains. He thought about his father's hand on his shoulder, the quiet certainty in his voice when he'd told Jaden he'd be fine. None of that certainty existed now. Security arrived 10 minutes later. Jaden saw them before they spoke. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a shaved head and mirrored sunglasses perched unnecessarily on the bridge of his nose, even inside the terminal. Another officer trailed behind him, younger and smaller, holding a clipboard. Meredith straightened at their approach, as though she had been waiting her entire life for this moment. "There he is," she said crisply, pointing at Jaden without hesitation. "This child presented a fraudulent boarding pass and has been loitering near the gate without proper supervision. He became argumentative when I asked for identification." Jaden felt the words fall around him like shards of glass, each one cutting, each one landing wrong. The taller officer turned to him, adjusting his sunglasses. "Son, do you have anyone here with you?" Jaden's voice came out thin and tight. "My dad is on the plane." The officer glanced at Meredith, who nodded curtly. "He claims that," she said, "but he had no valid ticket when I asked." Jaden's chest constricted. She tore it. The officer raised an eyebrow. "She did?" Jaden nodded quickly, pulling the torn pieces from where he had tucked them into his pocket, holding them out like proof of his own existence. The officer took them, turning them over in his gloved hands. His partner stepped closer, glancing down at the orange tag on Jaden's backpack. "Name?" the younger officer asked. "Jaden Devereaux." The man typed something into the tablet he carried, his brow furrowing as he scrolled. After a long moment, he glanced at the taller officer. "There's a Devereaux on the manifest. 2, actually. Marcus Devereaux, checked in about 30 minutes ago, and a minor listed under UM status." The taller officer frowned, turning back to Meredith. "UM?" "Unaccompanied minor," the younger officer clarified. Meredith's mouth pressed into a tight line. "He didn't provide identification," she insisted. "He was aggressive." Jaden stared at her, stunned. He had not shouted. He had barely spoken at all. The taller officer handed the torn ticket back to him. "It looks like his information checks out." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then Meredith shook her head slightly, her jaw tightening. "He still shouldn't have approached the gate without supervision. That's against policy." Alex, the young attendant with the headset, shifted again. His eyes darted between Jaden and Meredith, the conflict on his face sharpening. "He followed the rules," Alex said quietly, almost too quietly. "He checked in with me an hour ago. I verified everything." Meredith's gaze snapped to him, sharp enough to cut. "You should have said something earlier," she muttered, her voice low and pointed. Alex didn't answer. The family, across from Jaden, exchanged another glance, and the mother leaned toward her husband, whispering something he nodded to. Another passenger, a woman seated near the window with a travel tote in her lap, spoke up for the first time. "I saw him standing here," she said. "He wasn't doing anything wrong. He had his papers. She didn't even look at them." Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. A few more people shifted in their seats, their eyes turning toward the scene, toward the boy sitting alone while the adults circled around him like vultures. Jaden's heart hammered against his ribs, his throat closing around the relief and shame tangled together. He wanted to speak, but there was nothing left to say. Meredith folded her arms tighter across her chest. Policy exists for a reason. The taller officer turned to Jaden one more time, his mirrored glasses reflecting the terminal lights. "You good, kid?" Jaden nodded, though he wasn't sure the word had any meaning anymore. The officers stepped away, speaking quietly into their radios, the incident already reduced to lines on a report. Around Jaden, the terminal resumed its indifferent rhythm, boarding calls, footsteps, the drag of luggage. But something had cracked. Alex walked back behind the counter, his jaw tight, his headset crooked. The woman with the tote glanced once more at Jaden before returning her gaze to the tarmac outside. And Jaden sat still, the pieces of his torn boarding pass folded in his palm, knowing now what silence looked like. Not absence, but consent. The rhythm of the terminal moved on, indifferent to the fracture it had witnessed. Luggage rolled over polished floors, the sharp static of overhead announcements called passengers to boarding gates, and travelers continued to file through, faces turned toward their destinations, unaware or unwilling to see the small storm that had passed like a shadow near Gate 17. But for Jaden, the world had not righted itself. The tear in his ticket mirrored the tear inside him, a silent rip through something delicate that he could not name. He sat in his chair, his hands still curled around the remnants of the boarding pass, the orange, unaccompanied minor tag on his backpack catching the light. The voices of the officers had faded, replaced by the low murmur of travelers and the click of keys at the gate counter. Meredith stood behind the desk, arms folded tightly across her chest, her eyes fixed ahead as if she could will the entire incident away by sheer force of will. Alex moved stiffly beside her, his headset tilted awkwardly, his eyes avoiding hers and everyone else's. The woman who had spoken up earlier had returned to her seat by the window, glancing occasionally in Jaden's direction, but the weight of the silence had settled again. The passengers around him had watched, listened, and then folded themselves back into their own concerns, the way people do when the world reminds them of something they don't want to confront. Jaden's chest felt hollow, even though the officers had left without taking him away, even though he had not been dragged out or arrested. Something inside him remained crumpled, like the paper he still clutched in his hands. He had followed the rules. He had done everything right. And none of it had mattered. Somewhere across the terminal, footsteps approached, steady, purposeful, unhurried. They did not belong to security. They did not belong to a passenger rushing to make a flight. These footsteps carried the kind of weight that made people look up without knowing why. Jaden didn't notice at first. He was too busy staring at the torn ticket in his hands, trying to piece together what had just happened. But others noticed. Heads turned subtly. A murmur ran like a ripple through the people gathered near Gate 17, a shift in posture, a stillness that preceded recognition. Marcus Devereaux moved with the kind of quiet confidence that did not demand attention, but inevitably drew it. He was not tall in the way that made people step aside, nor did he wear anything that screamed power. A simple gray blazer, dark slacks, a white shirt without tie. But there was something about the way he carried himself, the way his gaze remained level and unhurried, that made the space around him recalibrate. He walked past the terminal shops, past the security checkpoint, past the gates he knew better than anyone. No one stopped him. No one even thought to. When he reached Gate 17, he paused for only a moment, his eyes taking in the scene before him, The scattered passengers, the stiff posture of the attendants behind the counter, the boy sitting alone, clutching torn paper in his hands. Jaden did not see him at first. Marcus's gaze shifted to Meredith, who straightened reflexively, her expression faltering the instant she recognized him. The color drained from her face, the practiced composure slipping like sand between her fingers. He did not speak to her. Not yet. Instead, he turned to his son. "Jaden." The boy's head snapped up, eyes widening. For a moment, he looked as if he might crumble entirely, but he held himself together, his fingers tightening around the remnants of his ticket. "Dad." Marcus crossed the short distance between them, crouching down so they were eye level. He did not touch Jaden immediately, sensing the tension still coiled inside him. "You okay?" Jaden swallowed hard and nodded once, though it was clear to anyone watching that he was not. "She said I had a fake ticket," he said quietly. "She tore it." Marcus's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He glanced briefly over his shoulder, meeting Meredith's eyes for the first time. There was no need for raised voices, no need for spectacle. The weight of who he was, not just the man, but what he represented, settled heavily in the space between them. When he stood, he did so slowly, turning toward the gate counter, his posture straight, his gaze sharp but composed. "Miss Caldwell," he said, his voice even, "did you scan my son's boarding pass?" Meredith's lips parted, her eyes flickering uncertainly. No, I didn't get that far." "Did you check the unaccompanied minor manifest?" "No, sir, Did you verify his identification?" She swallowed, her shoulders squaring defensively. "I didn't think I needed to. He approached the gate alone. That's not standard procedure." Marcus nodded once, absorbing her answer, then turned toward the younger attendant beside her. "Alex, is it?" The young man nodded quickly, the relief and apprehension warring on his face. "Yes, sir." "You checked my son in?" "Yes, sir. An hour ago. His documents were in order. He was listed on the manifest." Marcus's gaze did not waver. "Thank you." He looked back at Meredith, who stood rigid, her arms folded like armor. "My son's boarding pass was valid," he said quietly. "You didn't scan it. You didn't check the manifest. You didn't verify anything. You made a judgment." Her throat worked around words that did not come. The silence between them stretched, heavy and undeniable. Marcus glanced at Alex again. "Would you mind calling your supervisor, please?" Alex nodded quickly, tapping his headset. The passengers around them had stopped pretending not to watch. The hum of the terminal continued, but within the radius of Gate 17, a stillness had settled, the kind of stillness that meant something was about to change. Jaden remained in his chair, his backpack still hugged against his chest, his torn ticket folded carefully in his hands. He watched his father not with awe, but with something quieter, something that lived in the space between relief and exhaustion. When the supervisor arrived, moving briskly through the crowd, Marcus turned to meet him with the same measured calm. "Mr. Devereaux," the supervisor greeted quickly, his eyes flicking between Marcus, Meredith, and Jaden. "I was just informed. Please accept my apologies for the delay." Marcus inclined his head once. "Thank you. I would like to ensure that my son is allowed to board without further interference, and I would like the security footage from this gate preserved for review." The supervisor nodded immediately, already tapping on his tablet. "Of course. It's already being flagged." Marcus's gaze lingered on Meredith for a beat longer. "The problem," he said quietly, "is not that a mistake was made. It's how easily it was made, and how readily others accepted it. Meredith's arms had dropped to her sides, her face pale and tight, but she said nothing. The supervisor cleared his throat, speaking quickly. "Mr. Devereaux, I assure you we will conduct a full investigation. This is not reflective of our values." Marcus nodded once more, his expression unreadable. "I hope so," he said. He turned back to Jaden, finally reaching out to lay a hand on his son's shoulder. "Come on," he murmured. "Let's get you on that plane." And together they walked toward the boarding door, the terminal shifting quietly behind them as if the weight of what had just happened lingered in the air like a shadow no one could quite shake. The terminal at Gate 17 no longer buzzed with tension, but it did not hum with comfort either. What had unfolded over the last hour had left a residue in the air, something sour and unspoken that neither the returning announcements nor the shuffle of passengers could entirely wash away. Meredith Caldwell stood behind the counter, her shoulders stiff, her mouth pressed into a thin line. She kept her eyes fixed on the computer screen in front of her, though the boarding process for the flight had already ended. The terminal gate was quiet now, save for the occasional murmur of passers-by or the crisp, clipped orders from the supervisor still lingering near the desk. Jaden had disappeared down the jetway minutes ago, flanked by his father and a quiet attendant, but the shadow of what had happened remained. The supervisor, Dean Rosner, a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and a calm that seemed worn thin around the edges, stood beside Meredith without speaking. He had been called too late to prevent what had occurred, but just in time to inherit the responsibility for it. He tapped notes into his tablet, his jaw tight, his eyes flicking between Meredith and Alex. Alex stood a few feet away, the headset dangling uselessly around his neck now, his posture slack, as if the weight of the last hour had finally settled on his shoulders. His eyes remained on the floor, and when Dean spoke, his voice was low but direct. "You understand what happened here today?" Meredith exhaled sharply through her nose, arms folded so tightly across her chest it looked as if she might implode under her own defenses. "I made a judgment call," she said, her voice clipped and brittle. "He approached the gate alone. That's against protocol." Dean glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Protocol doesn't include ripping a passenger's boarding pass in half." "He didn't have identification," she insisted, her voice rising faintly. Alex shifted beside her, finally lifting his gaze. "He did." Meredith's eyes snapped to him. "Excuse me?" Alex swallowed hard. "I checked him in myself. I verified everything. He had the proper paperwork. He wasn't roaming. He was waiting where I told him to wait." Meredith's mouth parted, but no words came. Dean took a breath, tapping something else into his tablet. "It's not just the decision you made," he said quietly. "It's how quickly you made it and why." A ripple of silence passed between them, heavy and unavoidable. Across the terminal, in a room that was quieter, more controlled, Marcus Devereaux sat in a glass-walled office, his expression carved from something harder than stone. The assistant supervisor sat across from him, speaking quietly, carefully outlining the next steps. The preservation of the security footage, the initiation of an internal review, the protocols that would now be audited. Marcus listened without interrupting, his eyes focused, his mind already moving several steps ahead. He had spent years in boardrooms, negotiating contracts, fighting battles far more intricate than this one. But this was personal. This was not about numbers on a spreadsheet or quarterly reports. This was about the space his son inhabited in the world, and how easily it had been denied to him. When the assistant supervisor finished speaking, Marcus leaned back in his chair, folding his hands carefully in his lap. "I want a full account of every interaction at that gate today," he said quietly. "Every report, every employee statement, and I want the footage reviewed." The supervisor nodded quickly. "Of course, Mr. Devereaux." Marcus's gaze did not soften. "This is not about punishment," he continued. "It's about recognition. We cannot fix what we refuse to see." He stood then, smoothing the front of his jacket, and without another word left the office. Back at the gate, the air remained tense. Meredith remained at her post, stiff and silent, while Dean issued quiet orders into his tablet. Alex, now off duty, lingered awkwardly by the gate, unable to leave, unwilling to pretend that he could. It wasn't long before word of the incident began to spread. Within hours, emails circulated through the company's internal communication channels. Managers spoke quietly to their teams, preparing statements, crafting apologies that might sound sufficient, but could never quite reach the bone-deep truth of what had occurred. By the following morning, the ripple had become a wave. An internal memo from the CEO's office outlined the investigation, a company-wide review of policies concerning unaccompanied minors, passenger interaction, and the identification and de-escalation of implicit bias. The memo did not name Jaden Devereaux directly, but everyone knew. At the center of the maelstrom, Marcus worked quietly and deliberately. He declined all requests for comment. He refused to participate in the performance of outrage that others seemed eager to engage in. Instead, he focused on the system itself, on the policies, the procedures, the training sessions hastily scheduled in response to what had happened. He read every report. He watched the footage, and when he spoke not of punishment, but of the rot that had made the punishment necessary in the first place. Meanwhile, Meredith remained suspended pending the investigation. She sat at home, the television on but muted, scrolling endlessly through news articles, employee forums, and message threads that dissected her actions, her choices, her failure. Each thread felt like a mirror, reflecting her face back at her from angles she had never intended anyone to see. Alex returned to work 2 days later. He kept his head down, did his job, but something in him had shifted irreversibly. When he looked at passengers now, he looked longer. He listened harder. And when a colleague made a joke or a careless comment, he no longer let it slide. Jaden arrived at the robotics camp in Seattle and, for a while, let himself forget. The mountains still rose in the distance, sharp and beautiful against the sky. He met kids from all over the country, built machines with his hands, laughed without thinking. But every night, when the lights dimmed in the dormitory and the chatter of the other kids faded to quiet breathing, he lay awake and thought about the moment when he had been told, without words, that he did not belong. And every morning, when he packed his bag and walked back into the world, he carried that moment like a stone in his pocket, heavy, unspoken, but undeniable. The system had been exposed, but exposure was only the beginning. The days following the incident at Gate 17 unfolded with the slow inevitability of something larger than a single mistake. For most passengers who passed through the terminal, it was just another flight, another checkpoint, another blur of motion between two places. But for those who had been there, who had watched or stood silent or spoken too late, the air still carried the faint crackle of what had happened, an unease that lingered just beneath the surface. The company's internal investigation moved forward swiftly. Emails had been sent, meetings scheduled, interviews conducted. Supervisors circulated statements about inclusion and responsibility, reminding employees of the importance of protocol, of the company's so-called values. But the words, neat and polished on official letterhead, did little to soften the edges of what had been exposed. Marcus Devereaux kept his distance from the public spectacle. He did not grant interviews or issue statements. He refused to let the incident become fodder for headlines or corporate spin. Instead, he worked quietly behind the scenes, ensuring that the promises being drafted in memos translated into something real. He met with department heads, not as the owner of the airline, but as a father. He read every report, every apology email, every word of the training modules hastily rewritten in the aftermath. He asked questions others preferred not to ask, about how decisions were made, how assumptions took root, how silence had become policy long before anyone noticed. And when he spoke to the executive board, it was not in the cold language of liability, but in something sharper, something heavier. "This is not about what happened to my son," he said, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "It's about how easily it could happen to anyone else." The room had fallen silent. Jaden, meanwhile, existed in a space between two worlds. At camp in Seattle, the days were filled with structure and motion. Lessons on circuitry and coding, group projects, competitive challenges where his mind could stretch and spark in ways that felt safe, tangible. He worked alongside other kids who shared his interests, who talked eagerly about machines and algorithms, who competed fiercely but fairly. Most of them had no idea what had happened in the Sacramento terminal days before. To them, he was just another quiet kid with clever hands and a sharp mind. But the shadow of the airport clung to him like a second skin. At night, after the lights dimmed and the voices faded, Jaden lay awake, the memory replaying itself behind his eyes. The sound of the boarding pass tearing, the look on Meredith Caldwell's face, the way everyone around him had seemed to fold inward, unwilling to meet his gaze. He thought about his father's hand on his shoulder, the calm in his voice, the way he had stood without raising it, without needing to. He thought about how the entire world could stop for one person and keep moving for everyone else. One evening, halfway through the 2-week program, Jaden sat on the edge of his bunk, sketchbook open in his lap. He drew not robots or machines, but the airport terminal, the gate, the chairs, the counter, the people frozen in the moment he could not forget. At the center of the drawing, he drew Meredith's face, not angry or cruel, but ordinary, almost tired. Above her head, on the glass window behind the gate, he wrote 2 words in careful block letters: "Be better." The next day, he mailed the drawing home in an envelope addressed to himself. A reminder, he told himself, not to forget. Back in Sacramento, consequences took shape. Meredith Caldwell had been placed on administrative leave almost immediately after the incident. Her file was reviewed, her past evaluations revisited. She sat at home during those weeks, the blinds drawn, the television on mute, her phone lighting up with news alerts and emails she did not open. The investigation concluded without fanfare. The decision, when it came, was clinical and impersonal. A formal termination letter citing a violation of protocol, a failure to exercise professional judgment, and conduct unbecoming of her position. Meredith read it twice, her eyes tracing the words without feeling them. She had known, long before the letter arrived, that it would end this way. But the worst part had not been the decision itself. It had been the silence in the days afterward, the realization that she had been so certain, so sure, and so wrong. Alex, too, carried the weight of that day. Though he had not been the one to tear the ticket, though he had not spoken the words that had broken the boy at the gate, he had stood there and said nothing for far too long. When his shift ended, when the review concluded and the company cleared him of any wrongdoing, he still felt the sting of his own inaction. He requested a transfer to another terminal, one where fewer people knew his name, where the weight of what he hadn't done might feel a little lighter. Dean Rosner, the supervisor, sat in a conference room weeks later, reviewing the final report, a file thick with statements, footage, and recommendations. The language was precise, the conclusions clear. But nothing in the report could capture the moment when a 12-year-old boy had looked up at the world and learned that the rules he had followed so carefully could be torn apart in front of him. The company launched a new training initiative in the weeks that followed. Mandatory sessions on implicit bias, de-escalation strategies, protocols for unaccompanied minors. Videos, seminars, workshops filled the schedules of staff across the country. The words in those sessions were carefully chosen, polished, and professional. But Marcus had insisted on one thing above all else, that they begin every session not with policy, but with a question. What did you assume before you asked? Jaden returned home at the end of camp, 2 weeks older, carrying a certificate of completion, a suitcase full of folded clothes, and the drawing he had mailed to himself. His father met him at the airport, waiting at the arrival gate, his presence quiet but certain. They drove home in silence at first, the city unfolding around them, familiar and strange all at once. When they reached the house, Jaden paused at the door, turning to look at his father. "Did they fire her?" he asked quietly. Marcus didn't answer immediately. "Yes." Jaden nodded once, looking down at the drawing in his hands. "I don't want her to lose everything," he said. His father's gaze lingered on him, something soft and sad in his eyes. "Consequences aren't the same as punishment," Marcus said finally. "And change doesn't come from erasing people. It comes from making sure they understand why they were wrong." Jaden looked at the drawing again, the words he had written above the glass gate window, "Be better." He folded the paper carefully, tucking it back into his sketchbook. Some lessons stayed long after the flight had landed. The city stretched out beneath the wing, a quilt of lights and shadows sewn into the landscape as the plane descended toward Sacramento. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving behind a canvas of deep blue and scattered stars, the edges of the world softened by night. Inside the cabin, the passengers shifted in their seats, fastening seat belts, stowing away laptops and headphones, preparing for the brief and inevitable return to the ground. Jaden sat by the window, his forehead leaning lightly against the cool glass. The faint hum of the engines vibrated beneath his feet, a steady thrum that had, over the past 2 weeks, become something familiar. Outside, the city lights shimmered like scattered embers, distant and harmless. The camp in Seattle felt both far away and impossibly close. He carried the weight of those days quietly, tucked somewhere between his folded clothes and the drawing he had mailed back to himself. His certificate of completion rested safely in his backpack, creased at the corners but intact. He had not spoken much on the flight home, offering polite smiles to the flight attendants who greeted him, nodding at the woman assigned to escort him from gate to gate. She had been kind, careful, the orange tag on his backpack drawing not suspicion but attention this time, measured, deliberate, professional. When the wheels touched down on the runway, Jaden felt a small, involuntary exhale slip from his lips. The landing was smooth, the kind that barely stirred the passengers awake. He remained seated as the others stood, stretching, gathering their belongings, shifting impatiently in the narrow aisle. A man in a worn denim jacket and graying hair passed by him, pausing briefly. "You held yourself well, young man," he said quietly, his voice low enough that no one else heard. Jaden glanced up, meeting the man's eyes, and nodded once. It wasn't until he was walking down the jetway, his feet echoing on the metal grating, that the weight of the return settled fully in his chest. At the end of the passage, past the last security checkpoint and beyond the glass doors, his father waited. Marcus stood calmly, dressed simply, hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the stream of passengers emerging from the arrival gate. His expression did not shift when he saw Jaden, but something in his posture eased, the faintest release of tension. Jaden walked toward him, his backpack slung over one shoulder, the drawing folded neatly inside. They did not speak immediately. Instead, Marcus reached out, resting a hand on his son's shoulder, steering him gently toward the exit. The terminal hummed around them, voices, footsteps, the occasional burst of laughter from arriving families. The world, as always, moved on. In the car, the silence between them was comfortable, familiar. The city, outside, rolled past the windows, headlights and street lamps casting fleeting patterns across the dashboard. When they reached a red light, Marcus spoke, his voice quiet. They finished the investigation. Jaden didn't look up, but he listened. "She's no longer with the company," Marcus continued. "The policies have been rewritten. Training's already begun." Jaden traced a finger along the seam of his backpack. "That won't change what happened." "No," Marcus agreed. "It won't." They drove on, the streets narrowing as they moved away from the airport, the neighborhoods growing quieter. "But it means it will be harder for it to happen again," Marcus added. Jaden nodded once, staring out at the familiar houses blurring past. When they pulled into the driveway, the porch light was on, casting a warm glow over the front steps. The house looked exactly as it had when he had left. Nothing out of place, nothing changed. Inside, his mother waited, her arms wrapping around him the moment he stepped through the door, holding him tightly, her breath catching faintly against his shoulder. "I missed you," she whispered. Jaden hugged her back, letting the weight of the trip settle finally in the space between them. That night, after unpacking, after the quiet conversation over dinner, after the hugs and the reassurances and the inevitable silence that followed, Jaden sat on the edge of his bed, the drawing unfolded in his lap. "Be better." The words stared back at him, simple and unfinished. In the days that followed, the incident faded from the news cycle. Statements had been made, policies updated, promises issued. The world, relentless in its forward motion, had already begun to look elsewhere. But not everyone moved on. In the weeks after his return, Jaden began to notice small shifts in the world around him. Subtle, quiet, but real. Employees at the airport who had once moved past him without a glance now paused, met his eyes, offered brief but genuine greetings. Signs appeared at the terminals, outlining new policies, reminding passengers and staff alike of the rights of unaccompanied minors, of the company's renewed commitment to fairness and safety. None of it erased what had happened. But none of it went unnoticed either. One afternoon, as he sat at the kitchen table sketching, his father stepped into the room, holding an envelope in his hand. "It's from the airport," Marcus said, setting it down beside Jaden's notebook. Jaden opened it carefully. Inside was a letter, typed neatly on company letterhead, and a small card. The letter was brief, but the words felt heavier than the paper. Dear Jaden, we are writing to express not only our apologies, but our gratitude. What happened to you at Gate 17 should never have happened. Your experience has led to real, lasting changes within our organization, changes that will protect and support others like you in the future. We cannot undo what was done, but we can and will do better. Thank you for reminding us why we must. Sincerely, Dean Rosner. Regional supervisor beneath the letter was the card, a laminated pass issued in his name, marked with the company's logo. Lifetime passenger priority status. Jaden traced the edge of the card with his finger, then set it aside. He knew that the pass, the words, the changes they claimed to make, none of it would fix what had happened. But it meant that someone had been forced to look, to listen, to acknowledge. And that mattered. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jaden sat on the back porch, sketchbook balanced on his knees. The sky above was streaked with soft pinks and deep blues, the stars just beginning to appear. His father joined him after a while, the silence between them easy. Jaden flipped to a fresh page, pencil poised. Do you think, he asked quietly, that one day someone like me will be able to move through the world without having to prove they belong? Marcus didn't answer immediately. He leaned back in his chair, staring up at the darkening sky. I think, he said finally, that every time someone like you refuses to disappear, it gets a little easier for the next person. Jaden nodded, the pencil moving steadily across the page, tracing lines that curved into something hopeful. When he finished, he closed the sketchbook gently, holding it for a moment before setting it aside. He didn't know if the world would ever be exactly what he needed it to be, but he knew now that he had the right to shape it. And that, for now, was enough. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful and meaningful stories. Watch the next video or explore others on the channel. Every story matters. And if you believe this message is important, share this video so others can see it too.